人力品やろう。
マジっすか？
前だけだったら楽しくない？なぜかすげえ。
じゃあなんか、じゃあこれは多分出さないと思うんですけど、出しても面白い。まあでもなんかこれ始めようと思ったら一回スラで詰めて。そしたらもう一個向こうに。
もう一個向こうに寄ってないです。もう一個向こうに寄ってもマイクないんで、多分ジャッジ全体的に前目の方がいいです。
この2列ぐらい。
そうです。
インプスライドにつながるやつ。
が良くない。
惜しい惜しい。
大丈夫です。
俺は始めれる。
Preparation time has expired. Before going to the round, I would like to congratulate all the 4 teams for proceeding to the grand final. Without further ado, I would like to call the Prime Minister to open the opening conference stage within 7 minutes. Here.
Thank you, Chair. We think the medicine made in such process is not guaranteed its security, so it's very dangerous. And also, we think such trials dangerous to people in developing countries who is conducted such trials. So we are happy to propose this motion. I have two arguments in my speech. First, such trials lead to dangerous consequences to people in such developing countries, and developed companies in institutions in developed countries shouldn't allow it. And secondly, the medicine made through such process is not guaranteed its security, and also it's harmful to the medicine's users. So let's move on to my first argument. The trials is very dangerous and very dangerous because the standard in such trials is very poor, and so it is not guaranteed its security. For example, the trial in developed countries will go through the process that firstly do trial but with animals, and then if the security is guaranteed, then it is tried with humans. But developed countries, because when in the status quo, many institutions in developed countries will use the trial in developing countries because it is in short term and it is low price. But because it is in short time and low price, such trials in developing countries immediately conducted with humans, and also it is conducted to humans. So then the people who is conducted such trials are more likely to suffer from the side effect or so of such medicine, because the medicine security is not guaranteed at then. So it is very serious problem, and especially people in developing countries will suffer, likely to suffer from this problem. So cooperating, such as funding to it, also cooperating or using such data also means that this institution in developed countries is supporting such dangerous trial and allowing people in developing countries is suffer from such dangerous thing. So it is very problematic, and if constitution in developed countries allow it, because the constitution in institution in developed countries have large effect to whole world. They make the norm that it is okay to in developed people in developing countries suffering from such dangerous consequences. So it is very problematic. And the second argument, the medicine made through this process is not guaranteed security, and if it released, it is very problematic because of such poor standards of that. It is likely to that the company in developing countries don't say accurate consequences, or so then the security of such medicine is not guaranteed, and it is more likely to have dangerous side effect or so than the trial is made in developed countries. So, if the dangerous medicine released, many people will use it, and then much more people are likely to suffer from such side effect or so. So also is then the side effect is very serious problem because due to the side effect, some people may become disabled people, or at worst cases they can die. So it is very serious problem. So we are happy to propose. Thank you.
Prime Manager for your speech. Now I'd like to follow on their obligation to open the operating opportunity case within 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although we can't completely rely on the data or medicine which comes from the developing country, however, we can, a lot of people are saved by those medicine or data under the current situation, right? But if we take this proposal, especially for people who won't lose the chance to get those medical treatments, right? So we think those situation is seriously harmful to those vulnerable people. So we strongly oppose this proposal. Two arguments coming from my speech. Firstly, I'd like to describe the current situation of the society, and I'd like to explain what will be really cost if we take this proposal. And secondly, I'd like to make value judgment why the medical institution in developed country should still use the data from the developing country. But before that, I'd like to give rebuttal to the government side. They say that some people will be seriously affected by those unreliable medicines, right? However, we think it is not true because even if the developed countries medical institution using the data from the developing country, which does not automatically mean that those data is always unreliable, right? Because they are profit seeker, they have to care about the patient, they have to care about the customers, so they use the data which are reliable to some extent, right? So in those situations, even if we consider we can completely affirm that they use the completely reliable data, considering the capital of those medical institutions, we can say that at least those medical institutions give the minimal level of the quality of medicines, right? So their claim is not so important. Moving on my first argument, so it is about context of this debate. Under the status quo, medical institutions in developed country are using data or medicine coming from the other country, right? And they use the they use the data from the developed country, and but also they use the data from the developing country, right? Which means that they can apply with the they can answer the need of the all citizens under the in the society, right? Rich people will prioritize the reliability of the medicine over the money, right? So for those rich people, those medical institution sell the medicine or medical treatment which using the data from the developed country, which using the data, which using the reliable data, right? But also at the same time, they have to consider the poor people as the customers, right? In those situations, they use the to some extent unreliable data from the developing country, right? Which we think it is the current situation of the society, right? However, if we take this proposal, because all medical institutions have to use the medical data or medicine above the average, above the criteria, they have to use the reliable data from the developed country, right? Which means that they have to make the medicine only for the rich people, right? They can make the medicine by only using the reliable but expensive data from the developed country, right? We think those situation is seriously problematic for our people, right? Because if we take this proposal, and because the price of the medical treatment will increase, especially for people lose the chance or opportunity to get the medical treatment, right? So in those situations, the medical institution cater only to the rich people. We think those situation is seriously problematic. Yes.
If you want to save these people so much, why don't you just decrease the standard in developed states? Why do you have to exploit these developing states to get that kind of profit for the people in your own country?
If we decrease the if we decrease the level of the criteria, the vast majority of the medicine will be the unreliable medicines, right? In those situations, we can't guarantee the level of the medicine. So we'd like to say that those medical institutions have the duty to guarantee the minimum level of the medicines, right? So we want decrease the level of the criteria. Moving on my second argument, so value judgment. So why developed countries institution should still use the data from the developing country. Government side may say that because the patient will become irrational, and they will rely on the unreliable medicines, right? And they use the paternalistic justification. However, as I already told you, at least in our paradigm, in our paradigm, because those medical institutions care about the customers, we can guarantee the minimum level of the medicines, right? So those situations is not so unrealistic, right? So but we think our world is better than their world. Why? Because we can at least say that we can give the chance or opportunity to be cured or helped by those medical treatment, right? In our paradigm, the patient, individual people can take their own choices by themselves, right? They if they prioritize the price and the quality of the medicine, they can use the high expensive medicines, right? However, if you'd like to have your family, and if you are very poor and you don't have any alternative to do that, we think that we should let them to take that choice, even if it is to some extent unreliable, right? Mr. Speaker, in our paradigm, we can at least say that we can give the opportunity for the poor people to take the medical treatment, right? However, in their paradigm, the medical institution cater only to the rich people, and the poor people lose the power or lose the chance to be cured, right? We think the situation is seriously immoral, and as the medical institution, we should maximize maximize the option of the all citizens, especially most vulnerable people, especially poor people, right? So for these reasons, we strongly oppose.
Thank you, Leader Opposition, for your speech. Now we'd like to call on Victor Prime Minister to develop the opening government's case within 7 minutes. Go ahead.
I'm going to talk about three things in my speech. First of all, I'm going to deal with the entire cases from the leader of opposition. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why the current standard of the clinical trials inside of the developing country is really problematic and why this is producing the kind of structure exploitation. And thirdly, why developed country is contributing such kind of exploitation and why this is quite involved and how, in our paradigm, this exploitation can be improved. Move on to my first issue, rebuttals toward leader of opposition. So, the main case from the leader of opposition is in order to guarantee the medical option, especially for the poor people, that we have to also use the technology from the developing country. But Mr. Speaker, we think that in the first place, the benefit of poor people inside of the developing country is not relevant to this debate. Why is that so? Because in the first place, generally, the new technology is really expensive, right? So if the people invent some new technology, only rich people can access to that technology, and then gradually the price of this technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper, which means that even if we use the technology from these developing countries, we can never guarantee the equal access to the medical services of the poor people. So in the first place, the case from the leader of opposition is not so relevant. And also, we think that in terms of the medical option, their side has really rather counterproductive. Why is that so? Because actually, as the motion said, some standard of the clinical trials in the developing country is not meeting the safer standard, which means that this technology are really likely to cause more side effects and so forth. So we think that on that occasion, if we easily use such kind of medicine or technology to the patient and it then causes serious side effect, rather it will harm their health and it will be counterproductive. And they said since these developing countries are profit seeker, they will publish only like reliable technology and so forth. But we can't know in the first place whether or not this is reliable because actually it doesn't meet to the safer standard of the clinical trials. So from these reasons, we think that this point is also vague. And also, we think that in the first place, we don't know any necessity to access to the active usage of technology from the developing countries. We think that also developed countries have enough amount of medical technology. For example, looking at Japan, we have a lot of medicine or technology to fight with even terminal diseases like cancer or diabetes and so forth. So they never ever proved us what is the uniqueness and unique harm of using the technology from the developing countries. And also we think that developed to some extent we can guarantee the good quality of medical technology only within the developed countries. So from these reasons, we think that entire case from leader opposition is failing. Move on to my second issue. So I'm going to analyze the current problem of the clinical trials. So as my partner said, in the developed countries, the actual standard of the clinical trials is set at a really higher level. So, for example, we conduct the annual testing, and we use mouse or the rabbit, and then we use chimpanzee or monkeys, and then we test this technology of medicine to the human body. And then we will do a lot of experiment, and then we will gather a lot of samples. But since it will take a lot of time and a lot of resources, we think the developing country hesitate to do such kind of process, and they are really likely to skip that kind of process. So, and yes, and if they set the standard of clinical trials in really higher level, they have to do auto try and error, and that's why this will, in order to avoid the developing country, tend to easily take the easily set the clinical standard of clinical trials at a really lower level. So, on that occasion, since the context is developing country, we think that the people tend to be poor comparatively than the inside of the developed country, and also the clinical. If in that occasion, if people do the clinical trial, first of all, they can gain out the money from the government, and also in the really short term, they can earn out the money from the government. That's why and also since there are also poor people who cannot access even the basic standard of the living, they might be really incentivized to obtain to such really harmful clinical trials. So we think that this is kind of exploitation of the poor people. Thank you. Just because they are really poor, the outer people obtain to such really harmful clinical trials. But since they're really forced by their poor environment, they have to obtain to the such bad environment, and as my partner said, in some cases it will greatly harm their bodies. So from those reasons, we think that setting clinical this lower standard of clinical trials is really harmful. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about how developed country is contributing to this exploitation. So we think that if developed country use or cooperate with the developing countries, it will contribute to the exploitation in 3 ways. So first of all, if the developed countries support this developing country, although they're setting very lower standard, it will simply justify the action of the developing country. And since out of the developed country has a really bigger effect than developing country inside of the world, the out of developing country think that this is very justifiable action. And secondly, if we developed country offer out of financial support to the developing countries, they will be really incentivized to do more experiment. And thirdly, we think that the main focus of the new technology inside of the developing country is to export the technology to the developed country. So inside of the developed countries, there are really less limited people who can afford to pay for these kind of new technology. So we think that the aim or focus tend to be the developed countries. But on that occasion, if we cooperate with the developing country and we utilize such kind of technologies, it will greatly incentivize developing country to do more. But in our paradigm, since developed country will never cooperate with the developing countries, it can greatly disincentivize the developing country to do such bad clinical experiment no more. So we see the current structure is very immoral, and developed countries should not ignore the responsibility. From those reasons, we are very happy to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for your speech. Now I'd like to call upon the Leader of Opposition to develop the opening opposition speech with the 7 minutes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, don't you think it is ridiculous when, although there is a possibility to save lives that can be saved using unstable, maybe unstable, but cheap technology in both developing and advanced nations, but lives are simply deprived because people cannot afford expensive medical treatment, such as cancer treatment, tropical diseases such as Ebola and dengue. So, I have 2 points in my speech. First point why developed countries should cooperate in saving lives in developing countries, in both developing and developed countries, with using cheap medicine. Second point, why this contributes to the betterment of medical conditions of developing countries, consequenting in the betterment of medical treatment as a whole international society. But before proceeding into my points, one rebuttal to deconstruct the opening government. So the OG mentioned that clinical testing is dangerous and therefore is a reason for taking this motion. Three layers of rebuttal. First of all, it's dangerous. So what? They did not link this danger to taking this motion. Second of all, danger is not mutually exclusive. Even in advanced nations, people have a high possibility of dying. These medical clinical tests are conducted because people don't know what the outcome will be on both sides. Clinical tests are dangerous in the first place, so this point simply does not stand. Third of all, I'll take you later. Third of all, that is consent for people in developing countries of taking these kind of clinical tests that are conducted. In general, clinical tests are conducted by paying relatively high rates of monetary award. The poor people are conceding of the possibility of dying or having severe side effects, and we say that the consent is okay because they would be able to use the money to improve their lives. But they are also understanding that in the worst case scenario, their lives might be deprived. So, I will now move on to my first point. Why developed countries should cooperate in saving lives in both developing and developed countries with cheap medicine. So, the opening opposition admits that clinical tests in developing countries are conducted maybe under unsanitary conditions. Maybe at times staffs are uneducated and do not endeavor to gain absolute accuracy in testing. But why such test results are necessary? True that these kind of test results might be inaccurate. Nevertheless, because of the inaccuracy and unreliability, these medicine data is sold cheaply to developed countries, its medical institutions. Meaning, using relatively cheap data, the developed countries' institutions would be able to create cheap medicine. Why? Because the price of the medicine will lower because the material price itself goes down. So these medicine will be. So who will these medicines be sold to? The poor people suffer. Our answer is that the poor people suffering from severe diseases in both developed and developing countries would be able to have access to these unstable but still cheap technology. So why corporations would be willing to do this? Because more profit would be expected than only selling expensive medicine to rich people. They would be able to, they would not, and not taking this motion means that these kind of institutions, medical institutions in developed nations would be able to enable access to cheap medicine in both developing in developed nations and both developed and developing nations, and to the people who are poor. That means they have the possibility and likeliness of saving more lives. That's why we say that these kind of positive effects could be expected in this debate, and that's why we should not take this motion. So poor people in the status quo, especially developed and developing nations, poor people suffer from low quality medicine. People in developing countries, poor people, especially in developing countries, suffer from low quality medicine produced within their country because less technology of making medicine is existing. However, if only the data is provided to professional institutions of developed nations, they would be able to save more lives because they would be able to assess the data in the first place, and they would be able to provide more information, more technological advancement by using such data. So, now, any POIs so far? Okay.
Why do you have to save more lives at the expense of these poor people in developing countries sacrificing their own lives.
Okay, so I've clearly explained that point because people in the status quo, poor people in developing and developed countries in the status quo lack access to medical treatment itself. That's why we are at least saying that by not taking this motion, we will have a better opportunity of saving more lives. We are saying that people who do not have access should be able to have access, and that's why we say that this point stands. So, his final argument: why not taking this motion contributes to the betterment in medical conditions of developing countries. So, in the status quo, developing countries' medical institutions are not necessarily reliable in producing medicine. As long as trades continue between medical institutions of developed and developing countries, that areas of improvements will come into light and solutions will become clear of how to overcome flaws in clinical trials. Thus, gradual improvement of medical clinical testing will happen and enable developing countries' medical institutions to start developing relatively cheap but more reliable medicines. The opportunity of the independent development of medicine will be deprived from developing countries' medical institutions if we take this motion. That is more detrimental for people because people who are extremely poor in developing nations, that consist the majority of especially developing nations, will never get an opportunity to have medical treatments in the first place. And that's why, because this motion saves the lives of the most vulnerable, we strongly oppose to this motion. Thank you.
Thank you to the opposition for your speech. Now I would like to call a member of government to extend the government speech within 7 minutes. Here.
Thank you, Chairperson. So, as a member of the second party, we would like to build up how passing this motion would make lives better for not only incentivizing the poor people in developing countries to go into this and stop it, but how this would help us create a better social situation in developing country and have a better and still maintain the things that developing country rich people enjoy. So in order to achieve that, we are first going to talk about how there is no consent in the current context of developing countries, poor people, and how if we pass this motion, there's going to be a benefit to these poor people and save the lives of developed countries as well. And in my argument, rebuttals are clearly embedded into my argument. So let's first start with my first argument. How these people living in developing countries do not have any consent whatsoever compared to the ones that are in the developed countries. All right, so now let's talk about the context of developing countries, right? So what happens in developing countries is that there are no laws, there are no enough laws, and the enforcement of these laws are also very, very, very weak, right? And they're actually, especially in developing countries, they can't really control, so they're people who have like weapons, gangs threatening people to do things that people don't want to do. And these people have a lot of power in developing countries, right? And then if you want to do something, if you want to get help to the court does not really function so much, so you can't really get law for enforcement. And then let's look at the characters that are going to be affected by these kinds of, by this medical action, right? These are the people that are the poorest, that are the people that are threatened by gangs. These are the people who are trying to live their lives, but then their lives are not going well, and they are basically in a way forced to go into this industry. And this is something that needs to be diminished, okay? Because you want to know why? Because in developing countries, there's the main source to earn income is through manual labor, right? And then if you decide to take this, and in many cases, you lose your arm or you have a physical difficulty, you can't go back to the source of labor that you have taken action to. This is an irreversible thing that happens towards them, and it's just a thing that should be stopped right now, right? And then, however, in developed countries, they don't do this. So in developed countries, they don't do this. We don't try to make profit out of these poor people, right? So in developed countries, what do? We don't allow organ transplantations for profit. We definitely don't do that because of the reasons I have explained before. And we don't allow clinical testing in very low, unsafe conditions so that these poor people won't be exploited because of that either. And the reason stands in the same level. It's because this kind of irreversible damage that could happen to people are not accepted. So the government in developed countries where laws are more enforced, they ban it because they want to protect their citizens, poor, rich, whatsoever. They all have the right to live rightfully, right? And this needs to be enforced in developing countries as well. And I have made my point clear there. So now let's talk about how the situation will change in this after plan after we pass this motion. All right, so right now, there is a demand for medical testings like this in the status quo, right? So, and right now, rich people, they need these kind of medical testings right now because they can't do it in developed nations and they need the data whatsoever. I'm sorry, okay. So then what they do is that the companies too desperately need the data of humans that have taken these actions because obviously it's cheaper and it's more efficient for them to gain more profit through this. All right, but then if we could pass this motion, everyone, if we could pass this motion, what would happen is that these developing countries these corporates of developing countries as well, will either have to take a choice either to make the right decision and increase their safety level of standards to the same as developed countries, or stop their business, stop whatsoever, get out of the business, exploiting poor, vulnerable people, right? So if this could happen in the context, what would change? It would be good for both the poor people and the people in developed countries that are going to receive this medicine. The situation will change for them. All right, so let's first go to what would happen to the poor people. So for the poor people, there are no any kind of things any kinds of money that would be flowing in, taking this horrible kind of inhumane kind of medical testing, right? So now they either have a choice not to do it, and if it's like a safe testing where they're able to get a little income and then go back to their lives as normal, they will still have, that would be something good, right? So that is not dangerous at all. So this is great. And then in usually cases, if they're given a choice, most likely they don't want to go bankrupt. So companies would revert back to the right form and have safety, good standard safety choices that have a same level as developed countries into action, even for the people in developed country, right? And then if they do this, what would happen is that they could still get their numbers, right? And still develop medicine, right? And they'll still be able to create new medicines to help the people. So if we pass this motion, everyone, not only that we save the proper rights of the vulnerable people in developing countries, we could still keep the advancing of technology and making new medicines. And to protect the rights of these both people, we are very happy to propose this motion.
Speech. Now I'd like to call a member of opposition to extend the opposition case within 7 minutes. Go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, we think that the opening half has been sort of a deadlock, right? Because there are obviously going to be poor people who receive medical treatment, and some people will not have any harms and will just get money. Some people will receive harms and like receive consequences that they didn't consent to, right? There are going to be both sort of situations, and we don't really see which one is more likely to happen. And when closing government talk about this fairy tale land where everything goes well, we don't necessarily think that is also going to happen, which I will talk about in detail later. So, as closing opposition, we're going to talk about how allowing these sort of lax regulations in developing countries is going to encourage medical institutions to try to invest in these countries to create an environment that is similar to the ones in first world countries. We'll be using things like characterization and context, and also examine what kind of medicine there is demand for in the modern world, and what kind of medicine these medical institutions try to develop in the first place. Before that, one quick rebuttal towards the closing government side. So we talked about how these people who sign up to these clinical trials, they aren't really consenting to it, right? Because these gangs force them, or these people who have power force them. First of all, we don't think that there's any incentive for gangs or rich people to force poor people to have these clinical trials in the first place, right? Because there's obviously nothing to gain for those sort of people to do that. We think that in the majority of cases in which a poor person puts themselves up for a human clinical trial is because that person wants the money. We think that that is the more realistic incentive that lies behind this. More incentive of these poor people, right? And we believe that when poor people really desperately need money, it's okay for them to be able to assess the risks that they'll be put into. For example, even we don't ban these poor people from working in factories with pollution, right? Just because there's pollution there, or we don't allow them to stop working in fields just because they might have something some damage from pesticides, right? Then we think that even if there is a certain amount of damage that can be done to that person, if that person still consents to it and still wants the benefits that come with taking that risk, we should allow that. We should allow that, right? And also, second of all, we talked about this magical fairy tale land where everything is going well, but we think that because only these developing countries have the lax regulations, the loose regulations that allow medical institutions to freely do the kind of experiments and the kind of clinical trials that they want to do. This brings a unique benefit to developing countries, which brings me to my argument about how this is going to incentivize developing countries to invest more in the living standards of developing countries. So, first of all, we think that in developing countries, the status quo, these regulations for medical trials are extremely lax, right? They're not as tough as those places in developed countries, because in developed countries, there's a lot of transparency, or there are a lot of medical groups that lobby against all doing these basic clinical trials, right? Because there's such a strong regulation here, we think that developing countries have a clear advantage when calling these medical institutions to do experiments inside their countries, right? And we think that this is a unique advantage that developing countries can use for their advantage. But to understand this, first I want to talk about medicine and what the field of medicine in the modern world is like right now, right? So we think that while medical institutions do want cheaper medicine, they also want accurate information. They also want real information, right? Why? Because if they accidentally make a piece of medicine based on a really wrong piece of data, that can have severe consequences for their reputation and for their reputation and things like that. So we think that they do have they do have an incentive to keep on developing accurate data and to get that kind of data in the first place. So what kind of medicine do these medical institutions develop exactly? We think that it's medicine that is used in developed countries, right? Why? Because the fact is that developing countries aren't much of a market. Even if you make these shots or these sort of medicine that only for diseases that are specifically in developing countries, because there's no market to buy those medicines in the first place, you can generally never get the return that you invested in trying to do research about that medicine in the first place. So actually, in the status quo, almost all of the developed countries in the world and the medical institutions in those developed countries are mostly focused on creating medicine for developed countries, right? And we think that in this case, so we think that those are the type of medicines that are generally put up for sale. And we think that in these sort of cases, of course they want cheaper and easier data under lax regulations, but they also want data that can be used for developed country people, right? Because people in developing countries and people in developed countries have totally different living people in developing countries don't necessarily have water, they don't necessarily have good food. They have completely different living standards. But we think that medical institutions want them to have the same living standards so they can get the accurate data that they can also apply simply and cheaply to these first world countries to begin with. So what do we think the medical institutions are going to do when we allow this sort of competition? We think that they're simply going to invest more in developed countries. Or first of all, we think that medical institutions themselves are going to try to invest more in developing countries. Second of all, in places like America, where the pharmaceutical industry has huge influence over politics and things like that, we think that they're also going to lobby the country to try to invest more in those developing countries so that they can get the first world living standards, so that countries so they can use the information that was used in those developing countries and apply them directly to developed countries, right? And we think that this is extremely important. We think that this is extremely important, right? Because the field that they're going to be investing in are the poor people in these developing countries. Why? Because we think that simply rich people in developing countries will not try to get these clinical trials in the first place because they have no incentive to. They already have the money. The people who volunteer to have these clinical trials in the first place are very poor people who have very different living standards from people from first world countries. So in order to make this data directly applicable to first world countries, we think that they're going to invest in things like infrastructure so that poor people can get good water, good food, right? We think that they're going to invest in things like charities to get food to these people, or try to make their living conditions more similar to first world people so they can directly apply this information cheaply, right? And we think that this is extremely good because in the cases of charities or in the case of lobbying to governments, you're actually creating direct investment towards the poor in those developing countries. And even we think that they want this because they have a bigger experimental field and they have more people that they can experiment on who have similar living standards to first world countries, right? So why is this extension uniquely important in this debate? We think it's important because while this debate has been very small so far, just talking about individuals, we think that it can lead to better development in the long run for these developed countries, right? And we think that because more people can be saved by doing this, and because the benefits that we're talking about are tangible and real compared to the vague notions that come from the Mongolian government, we are proud to oppose.
Thank you, Member Opposition, for your speech. Now let the Government Whip to finalize the government scheme within 7 minutes. Shake it.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's a reason why we have regulations in developed countries. The reason why we have developed restrictions for human clinical testing is because they provide irreversible damage to these individuals, and it's very difficult for these individuals to actually get consent. We think that this principle, or this basic human rights, or this basic principle for these individuals does not automatically change just simply because you're in developing states. We think it's wrong to save lives by exploiting poor people in Bangladesh or poor people in Southeast Asia. So we're very proud to propose today's motion. So my speech, I'm mainly going to summarize this debate from two perspectives. First, I'm going to talk about whether it's actually justifiable whether in the status quo of these companies exploiting poor people, is this really justifiable? And second of all, I'd like to talk about on the practical level, whether this will help the poor or not. But before that, a few levels of engagements to closing opposition. So firstly, they talked about how this will actually increase investments to these countries because it profits that pharmaceutical country. But we don't think that's necessarily true. Look in the status quo. These companies are not investing, for example, in the status quo, these companies are already using this data, already getting profit, but they're not investing in these countries. not true. That's not happening in the status quo. Second of all, we don't think that's going to happen because pharmaceutical companies are profit seekers, right? Because the whole op bench was talking about how this benefit these developing countries as well. But we think when these pharmaceutical companies actually create medicine, they're much more as a profit seeker. They want to sell it to people who have money, right? That's not people in developing countries, but rather in developed countries where people actually have money are the people who are going to buy it. So we think that whole assumption from op bench that's saying that this potion actually benefits because they will provide medicine for these developing countries, that's just not true because it simply does not make money and these pharmaceutical companies are not doing it right now. Second of all, even though we take this plan, that doesn't mean that we're not going to buy, that doesn't mean that we're automatically not going to buy data. We talked about how companies will increase their incentive to increase the standards of clinical testing, and they'll still get that kind of profit, or they'll still be able to buy data. So if that investment in these developed countries are so profitable, as closing opposition say, we think that they'll still continue whether we take this motion or not. So let's go on to our arguments. But before that, I want to clarify, because the previous speaker talked about, well, these people already consent to it, and that, for example, people in like really dangerous conditions, are you going to ban that too? Like they talk about pesticides or like really bad working environments. But we think that the extent is completely different of the harms that we provide to these individuals, right? Because recognize what kind of things that they're doing in developing countries are things that they cannot do in developed countries. That means they're very dangerous, or they provide irreversible damage, or something that they have no information about and randomly providing it on people. So we think that the extent of the harms that we provide to individuals is very wrong. But secondly, we talked about how it's very difficult to get consent, right? Because there's not enough information for these people, or these poor people manipulated to actually doing it. So we think that it's difficult for these individuals to actually get that proper consent, we think that what they're talking about is not necessarily true. So let's go on to the clashes of whether this is justifiable or not. So let's look at what each side talked about. So opening opposition talked about, well, we could save lives by this because we could provide more medicine for these people in developed countries. But they never explained why it has to be at the expense of exploiting poor people in developing countries. I asked in my POI, if they want to help people that much, then why don't you decrease the standards in developed countries? But the reason why they weren't able to answer that is because they understand or they recognize the importance of these high standards of individuals. They understand that when they have low standards, it's very easy to exploit these people and exploit these poor people to opt into that. And this is where my part of this extension comes into shine, right? Because we talked about the context of these developing countries. For example, these poor people are illiterate. They tend to be, for example, illiterate. So it's difficult for them to actually understand the harms. Even though this doctor tells you there'll be this kind of harm, they can't. No, thank you. They can't maybe they can't even understand it. Or maybe when they borrow money from games, it's easier for these people to say, go and do that kind of go and do that clinical testing. So we think in that kind of we think that the harms that we think it's not justifiable to actually use these poor people to save lives. Even if you are going to save lives in developed countries, we think it's unjustifiable in these kinds of ways. Yes.
Okay, so if some institutions in developing countries are really exploiting poor people, as you are saying, will the institutions in developed countries will trade with them in the first place because they are concerned of their own reputation?
Well, the problem is that kind of problem doesn't come up, right? We don't, like these media, for example, for individuals in developed countries to actually understand that, they have, for example, seen the media, but they don't really focus on those kind of things because these developed countries are getting profit. They're hiding the fact. They're glorifying that we could save these individuals in your country and deprioritize or dehumanizing these developed countries. That's what we're saying is a problem. When they're saying we could save our lives, but at the sacrifice of other people, and hiding that and saying that that's not happening, ignoring the existence because they want to save the people in their own country. But that's not true. Lives are equal, right? We cannot just prioritize your own people, or we cannot just prioritize rich people in developed countries who tend to be more wealthy than developing countries. That was the whole argument of my partner. So let's go on to the second point. So as I proved how this is unjustifiable ways, even if you can save lives, at the end of the day, is this really beneficial for the poor? Because opening opposition talks about, well, this could be a choice for individuals because they could get money for it. But firstly, we talked about how it's an illegitimate choice because they're not fully consenting to it. But second of all, opening government just simply talked about the problems in the status quo. But my partner clearly talked about how this will change after the plan. We talked about how the incentives of these companies will change. For them to actually gain profit, they will have to change. And the reason why this is very beneficial is because we could save both people on both sides.
Poor people will still be able to do clinical testing, but it's at a higher standard, so they won't get detrimental harm. They won't have those severe harms, for example, like they have cancer, or they won't be able to work in the labor force. By these higher standards, we could help the poor people that government bench was talking about. But we also help the people that we were talking about, that opposition was talking about, because they'll still be able to provide data, or maybe they could still provide it cheaper because they have more people and stuff like that. And these companies on upside will be saved, and you'll be able to still have that data transition inside that benefits developing countries. So we think that's a clear extension coming from closing government of how it will actually change after the plan, and how we solve the deadlock of how we could both save the poor and both saving the people that they were talking about. So at the end of the day, we have all lives, it's really cliche, but all lives are equal, right? We cannot just prioritize people that are own countries and actually focus on these people who are being exploited and being manipulated to take these irreversible damage. We're very proud to propose.
Government reporter. Now I would like to call upon opposition whip to finalize the opposition case within 7 minutes.
The important thing in this debate is what the real future of when it terms of medical situation, or that is for all people, not only the rich people, but also poor people, right? That is going to be, and that is the important issue that we have to talk about, and that's why I'm proud to oppose this motion. And what I'm going to do in my speech is mainly 2 points. The first one is the response to the government side, and the second is why our argument is uniquely important compared to the opening opposition argument. And I'm going to talk about one by one. And the first one is about the response to the government side. There are mainly two things to reply. And the first one is about, because standard of human clinical trial is very low, creating more side effects or exploit the poor people that right occurs. However, it's not going to happen. And the first analysis is towards the creating more side effects. And on that point, because in the first place, by cooperating with the country, the institution in the developed country, because the institution in the developed country take care of the thing, and they are very afraid of becoming prevalent to the side effect with the partner of the corporation, so they never accept as data it is, and they examine and they elaborate and check, and the result of it, they prevail the data, they use the data as an effective way. So in that point, what they say as a harm can be very minimized in our side of the house. And also, the second one is exploitation by the poor people. It's clear response to us for bias. Because the existence of contract, even though it's by using money, the resulting consent, so that's okay, that is a clear response to us. And even if it's a dangerous situation like that, dangerousness are integrating the price to pay, and that is no problem. An example is two analogies here. The first one is about medicine. Those foods are examined, even in the developed country, don't know what's going to be and what kind of dangers has happened after using this drug, because that's the experiment. That's the way we prove
prove the accuracy of this kind of medicine, and also, so that not the problem only uniquely happen in developing country, uniquely happen in our side of the house, and also the example of dangerous and terrorist plus is the work in nuclear power plants, and that's also the result is not unclear. It is unclear in the status quo. However, we assume considering the dangerous, what we say, and this is what a member of government totally rebuts the problem. And second is about the characterization after taking this motion, and that is the characterization from the Korean government before that. So
We talked about how, for example, nuclear power plants is different because people in Japan know the consequence, but they still say yes. We talked about in developing countries, it's very difficult for these individuals to fully consent to the harms that are provided through these testing.
the analogy that I present here is the example, though we don't know what the consequences will be, but we accept by being paid for money, and that's regardless of the situation, because for the poor people, what kind of jobs? Yeah, okay, and let's go. The second one is about the characterization after plan given by the Korean government, and say what I want to say here is the too unrealistic because in the first place they say after taking this motion they increasing the standard or stop being that this is a very and the result is improving the standard, and that is what the member governments try to say. However, institutions developing bad because first of all, institutions in developing countries are very hard just by their own effort to improve their situation because it's very costly and it's very difficult for us. And we don't see how change occurs, how the situation in developing countries, and the most likely scenario here is they just produce cheap, low quality medicine for developing countries only that, and that's because low and cheap quality medicine still sell well in the developing country. They just need money, they just need medicine, whether or not it's a sure or not, and that's our debate, that's a response to the government side. And the second is about why is Korean opposition argument uniquely more important than the open opposition argument. And the open opposition argument is like to create affordable medicine. To create affordable medicine for poor people, cooperation use of data is required, and that's the main argument coming from the open opposition. However, in this point, open government argument, open opposition argument creates the deadlock, and they couldn't see how it's going to be in the short term and how it is beneficial in terms of saving the poor people in the developed country. And however, our member opposition presents the more clear contribution compared to the other side because they clearly present how in the long term medical situation is going to be, and that related to the many people, that all people around us, not only the poor people, but also all people. And what they explain is that how developing country institutions incentivize by not taking this motion to invest in medical field in developing country, and they characterize they explain it by using the word for the seeker of other things. They clearly to tell this kind of thing detailedly, and we as a team only positively present what realistic future, that is the important point, that is the important difference between the Korean government is going to be, and that's why I'm proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
お疲れ様でした。ディスカッションするので、どっちをついていきます。上田さん、お疲れ様でした。どこでするんですか？83 B か C。83C。
ディスカッション取りに行こう。